it's Lisa. I have a quilting video for you today, at least one where I want to share how I'm planning to utilize some fabrics and make the best use of some larger prints in a quilt. I belong to a local quilt guild, and sometimes when people are no longer in the quilting hobby, they will donate, or their family will donate fabrics to our guild. And we'll have some members who will go through the fabrics and put together a grouping of fabrics that they think go well together and will be enough to make a donation quilt. So the other night at Quilt Guild, I brought home this package of fabrics, and I'll show all of them to you. I was especially drawn to these colors because they're my favorite colors, and while I won't be keeping the quilt, I might as well enjoy working with my favorites while I'm making a quilt out of it. There are several fabrics here. Two of them are about a ½ yard, and they are decent sized prints. These paisleys and this floral, and I need to think about how I want to use these prints rather than cutting them up in small pieces. How can I use them in a larger size and get a really pretty quilt? Then I have a few things that I thought had more of a stripe or vertical element effect. This one also is around a ½ yard, and I just feel like this is something that I want to cut into strips and use in some way within my quilt. Now there's quite a bit of this. Almost, well, I think maybe a little more than a yard and a half. But again, it has that stripe effect to it, and I feel like I can work with that and really accentuate the design of the fabric in my quilt. Then lastly, there are these motifs, and they're pretty big. So again, not something I want to cut up into small pieces, but how can I take these and maybe cut out a single motif and use it some way in the quilt as a design element? So that's what I want to share with you, is the process that I'm going to go through for doing that, and then we'll see how the quilt turns out. Okay, let's start with these that I have a smaller amount of and then have a large print. What I'm thinking of doing is using them as part of the main part of a block and then doing some sashing around them. So I won't be cutting up and doing any kind of a design within this. I have no solids, I have no small prints unless I add something from my stash. Everything has a fairly big pattern. And I've always found this to be an interesting challenge when you have fabrics that have a larger print. They're beautiful, you want to use them, but what do you do with them? And so one of the things you can do is put them in the center of a block and then sort of build around that. So, or you can make them alternating blocks if you want a piece, do something interesting pieced in between. But in this case, I think they're going to be my main block. I just have to see how much I have and how big a blocks I can make. So this, I've got a measuring here on the end of my table. So this is the typical 40-something inch wide fabric, 40 to 42 inches wide, but it is 18 inches in length. Yeah, just over 18 inches in length, so I could get 18 out of this. And what I'm thinking about is how big a block that I can make. Now, I can't do a 9-inch block because I would need 9.5 inch cuts, and I don't have that much. I could do an 8-inch block and do 2 8-inch blocks going this way. How many can I go this direction if I do an 8-inch block? Well, again, I have about a little over 40 inches here in width, and I've got to have 8 inches wide, so, or 8.5 inches wide. So realistically, I'm only going to get 4 blocks going across instead of 5 blocks going across because I just don't have quite that much room. So I can do 4 going across and 2 going up and down, or 8 blocks that are finished size 8-inch square. So I want to make a note of that when I'm designing this quilt. So I can do some 8-inch blocks that are finished, and that's going to be 8 1/2 by 8 1/2. And I can do 8 of each fabric, and that's 16 blocks. So that would kind of define the size of this quilt and then kind of work out from there. Now, I really thought as I was working with this fabric and getting it prepped and ready to go, and I always pre-wash my fabrics and press them, test them for color fastness, that kind of thing. This particular fabric, I really thought of it as using it for sashing. Oh, and by the way, the paisley, I've already measured it. It's the same as this one, and it's going to be the same number of blocks, so that's why I have 16 total. Now let's take a look at this leaf fabric, because I can use this for sashing, but I need to consider, again, my cuts and how many I can make and how long I can make them and that type of thing. So what I need to do is I would want to take each of these and make it into a sashing strip. I mean, I could do like even a half of one, but I think that would look a little weird. I think I'd rather have it to where it looked like the defined leaf here. So the easiest way to do that is actually, instead of trying to measure across here, is actually measure from center to center. That's going to tell me what my width of these are. So 3 inches is the maximum width that I could cut them, which would leave me with 2.5 inch sashing strips. So what I would be doing is cutting 3 inches here and 3 inches here and so forth, so that this is in the center, but I'm only going to end up with 2.5 inches of actual usable space. So it's going to cut the leaves off just a little bit. So the brown fabric is going to be 3-inch wide cuts for 2.5 inch strips. Now, how many of those I can make is going to depend on how many of these pattern repeats that I've got. So I'm not going to count the one on the end because part of it's going to get cut off, so I'm going to start here. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I've got 13 of them, an odd number for sure. 13, and if I were doing this with 8.5 inch blocks, would I have enough to do 2 for each one? Let's see what we've got. So this is 19 inches. So I could get 2 strips. So I could do 13 by 2 or 26 that were no more than 8.5 inches. So I have to think about that also in terms of my sashing. So these are things that I'll consider when I'm starting to lay this out. And I use the Electric Quilt 8 software for laying out a quilt, but you could do this manually. You wouldn't have to have software to do it. Now the other thing that I want to look at here, that's not going to be enough sashing strips. I can already tell. So I'm probably going to need to pull some out of this. But this is a really long piece of fabric. It's a little over 1.5 yards. And so I felt like this could also be used for borders. So let's see how wide a design that we have here. And what I want is these little designs, I don't know what you would call them, these little starburst kind of designs. They look like sort of like a dandelion in each of my strips. So I've got quite a bit of width there. I have 6.5 inches or so between those designs. That one's 7 inches. So something like that. So 6.5 to 7 inches between each of those. So that's going to be quite a bit. So the other striped fabric, 6.5 to 7 inches. At this point, I don't think I need to get more specific than that. Because this is pretty large. I can cut it smaller or I can cut it a little bit wider. I could even use some of these strips and do some narrower strips. So I've got some playroom with this given how large the print is and how much fabric that I have to work with. And the last one is this medallion. And what I thought of with the medallion is that I would want to put these maybe at the corners of my blocks, but that's going to be a really wide sashing strip if I do something this big. So I may have to cut them down. I don't know at this point. So let's measure and see how big they are. The minimum size they are is 4 1/4. That's their finished width. So of course it'd have to be cut larger than that. But I've got, again, a lot of fabric, and so I can have a little bit of waste in here if I want to put these in the corners of the blocks. So there again, this is just something to think about. I'm not going to count up how many I have at this point. There's a lot in here. But when I start to plan the quilt, then I'll figure out how many of these I need. So now I'm going to go to the Electric Quilt 8 software and kind of take the idea that's running around in my head and put it into a layout using some of these measurements to see how if I can figure out how to make this fabric work with the design that I have in mind. So what I created in the Electric Quilt 8 software by deciding on my layout, the size blocks that I wanted, the number I wanted, and I just played with it a little bit till I got a quilt that looked the size I wanted and the arrangement I had in mind. And what kind of dictated the arrangement was the size of these blocks and then the size of these squares as well. And then I just worked out the sashing to match it. So these are going to be a finished 5 inches and these are a finished 8 inches. So I've already cut the 8.5 inch blocks that will finish up 8 inches. And I've got enough of these to where you can see my colors are not right. My printer is about out of ink, so it's just sort of printing whatever color it has ink for. So the dark purple is actually more my brown fabric, and then these lighter purples and then the whiter colors are the two prints that I have. But I can do these either way. I could put this one with the brown borders, or I can do this one with the brown borders. And I've had them up on my design wall, and I think I'm going to do this. I like the contrast between these. So what I have to do though is this fabric, the way the pattern repeat is I've got to do 2 stripes on each side for the sashing. And so I'm going to use some of that very wide stripe fabric to work with that and create these designs. But after I printed this out, I started counting. I didn't count beforehand, and I realized that I don't have enough of this. When I cut these pieces, I thought I was going to have 26 pieces. I had 24, but nonetheless, it's way too few for this particular design. So what I had to go back and do was realize that I had enough to do 6 of my main blocks with the full borders around them, or the sashing around them the way I wanted, and then the rest of them is going to have a solid piece that is from the striped fabric. There's just a wider version of that striped fabric. So I just reworked the design very quickly. It's something that's easy to do in the software, and took out the stripes and put in solids. So you can better see now how this is going to lay out. And then I needed to cut these in the I need to cut them 5.5 inches, so they'll be 5-inch squares. And that's where I am now in this process. Now there's going to be quite a bit of waste here, and I think some of the waste I can use with the backing fabric. This is probably going to end up being a little wider. This shows a border that I think I'd already thought about leaving off, but I'm probably not going to have enough of that striped fabric to do it anyway. So I'm probably going to leave the border off, but it's still going to be a fairly large quilt, and I may not have quite enough of the backing fabric that I bought, so I'm going to need to put something else on the back, and I think I'll be able to maybe do some strips using what's left of this fabric. So what I want is a medallion with the design centered in the 5.5 inch block. So to make that happen, I took 5.5 inches on this ruler, and I marked the center point with the point of this piece of washi tape. So what I do is just line the washi tape up on the center here of the design that I want to cut, and then I just cut around it. Once I've made the first cuts, then the rest of it I'm just using the ruler. So now I have a design that I can put in one of these corners, and I need 24 of these. So that's, if I don't have enough to get every design centered, then I might do something different around the edges or whatever. But I'm pulling out the cuts together, and I'll sew it up, and we'll see how the top of this quilt has come out. The completed quilt top came together really quickly because these are fairly large pieces. I put everything on my design wall so I could kind of keep the order of how I wanted to sew them, since I had to do some variations to the stripe pieces. So I had some darker backgrounds here and some lighter backgrounds here, and I played a little bit with how that was arranged. But for the most part, it wasn't that difficult to place each item. I sewed these blocks individually, and then I went through and pieced the rest of it together. I think this quilt is a real lesson in contrast. There is still a lot of pattern here, and if I had needed more fabric, I would have pulled some solids or some very prints that have very little pattern to them, or tone-on-tone kinds of things to break this up. But one of my goals was to use the fabric that I have been given as much as possible. I bought backing fabric, and I'll have to use something out of my stash for binding, but I wanted to use the fabric up. So to do that and to get something that you could discern the different blocks, I've really relied on contrast. So the dark background of these pieces helps to frame this block, and the light background of the medallion pieces really help to separate those out and give some distinction to that design element. So I had a lot of fun with the quilt, love working with these colors, they're my favorites. And what I'm going to do now is add the backing. And to do the backing, I had bought fabric for the backing, but it wasn't quite wide enough. So I had one more strip of this striped fabric that was left, and I used that to make the backing a little wider and just added a little bit of other scraps. I have almost nothing left, which was my goal. The medallion fabric is Swiss cheese, where I had to cut it up. And then the rest is just some small scraps, and that's it. That's all that was left from those original fabrics. To quilt this, what I'm going to do is probably just sort of a meandering design with maybe some loops and stuff in it. When we do the donation quilts, they like for them to not be heavily quilted. You want to quilt them enough to where the batting won't bunch up if it's washed. So every 3 or 4 inches, whatever the batting specifications are. But you don't, in our case, we don't want real super detailed quilting in here, because that will make a stiffer quilt, and you want it to have a more cuddly, warm kind of feel to it. So I'll just probably do some all over swirls. That's, I think, the best for this particular style of quilt anyway. And I'll show you that final one in the last few frames of the video. Thank you for watching, and I've enjoyed presenting this, and I hope that you have learned something. And I'd love for you to leave a comment and a like. And if you're already not a subscriber, please subscribe to my channel. And if this goes well, I'd like to do more of these, because I've really enjoyed getting back into doing videos. Thanks for watching.